If Iran it really has nuclear weapons in their stockpile and is ready to use them, they will use Israeli provocation to do a major attack. But Israel provoked this, so Israel is not the innocent party in this. Gold should be $5,000 an ounce now. It is completely and totally manipulated. It's only because of the strength of the global crisis that it's been allowed to eke up to 2,400. Now, Russia's ready to strike militarily the West, has been for many years, has the largest nuclear stockpile by far. And Russia is, I will repeat, is an existential enemy. They are going to strike the West someday. In every single war, the West has always been caught with their pants down in terms of armaments. They want, you see, the U.S. military decapitated in a joint Chinese-Russian strike. They just have to wait until the proper moment and the proper trigger event. But the U.S. does have anti-satellite weapons. Russia and China are developing anti-satellite weapons. There's going to be an anti-satellite war. So this is a very real threat, and people need to prepare. And that will start World War III. And you'll know that's going to start if you see this blow up in Korea and Taiwan and Korea. I say you got about 3 weeks before we're in an all-out nuclear war. Don't confuse knowing what's going to happen with being prepared for what's going to happen. When these bombs fly, it's not the time to prepare. When the electricity goes out, it's over. Your time of preparation is done.
Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. Joel Skousen is an author, survivalist, consultant, geopolitical analyst who's made several accurate predictions over the years. That's part of the reason why I wanted to have him on in our initial conversation, because I caught wind of you talking probably 10 years ago, almost predicting to the year when Russia and Ukraine would go to war. And of course, we all know how that played out. And you recently, in one of our recent conversations, predicted that you thought that Iran was getting ready to make its move. And I should also add that you are the author of Strategic Relocation, which is a great prepper book, as well as other prepper books, including the High Security Shelter book, which I encourage people to check out. You can see that on joelskousen.com. Now, like I said, in our last interview, you predicted that Iran was finally getting ready to make its move. You didn't think it was ready during the time of the Soleimani assassination. Can you tell us a bit, like, what is your take about what is going on here, and what are your predictions for this crisis?
Well, thanks, Nate. This is a very interesting and crucial topic. We have to remember that ever since I made those statements about in 2019, Israel has been continually trying to provoke Iran to attack itself. They have been striking Iranian and Iranian proxy bases in Syria consistently, almost weekly, year in and year out, and including the airport in Damascus and other, civilian sites. And Iran has refused to respond until now. And the reason I think that they responded now in a limited manner, and I want to emphasize that it was a limited strike, is that Israel went outside the bounds of international law and struck an Iranian embassy in Damascus. This is a no-no. Even in wartime, you don't strike somebody else's embassy unless you're trying to provoke them in the ultimate way, and it worked. They finally got Iran to strike back, but it was in a limited sense because Iran still isn't ready. And this is the primary evidence that I have that Iran's nuclear program isn't ready yet. And that's what's causing them to be reluctant to go to all-out war to Israel. So they struck, with about 300 aerial missiles, drones, targets. 97% of those were shot down by a combination of U.S. F-15s that were in the air, Jordanian F-16s, and others using anti-missile things. They shot down several of the more difficult ballistic and cruise missiles there. And the drones, which were flying over 1,000 miles, were relatively easy to shoot down. They're a slow mover, and so the Israeli Arrow system got that. And the reason the Arrow or the Iron Dome combination, Israel has a variety of missiles, anti-weapon missiles. They have the very expensive Patriot-type missiles as part of the Iron Dome system, but they also have the cheaper, smaller interceptor missile, which only costs about $40,000 a piece. And they used those mostly to intercept these to be able to save their more expensive $1 million missiles for what's certainly going to be a much larger barrage when they finally do go to war. And so this is one of Iran's tactics, is to use up the supply of Israeli and U.S. Missiles, anti-missiles, so that when they do overwhelm the Iron Dome system, Israel and the U.S. runs out of missiles. That's what Iran's tactic is going to be. Now, the proof of this, Nate, is the fact that the Biden administration is leaning heavily on the Israelis not to do a major counterattack. Now, first of all, we have to remember that this is a counter to the counter, because Israel provoked this, and we have to be very clear, just like they provoked or opened the door for the Hamas attack on southern Israel by pulling 80% of the Gaza battalion out of southern Israel. This telegraphed a very clear signal to Hamas: we're wide open, come on in. And of course, they didn't respond to the breach of the fence. And their troops were 7 to 8 hours away from being able to respond to this, except for helicopters. And the helicopters did have some friendly fire. They did shoot some of their only people when they're mixed up with this. It was a mess. But Israel provoked this, and they provoked this attack as well. So Israel is not the innocent party in this. Now, Iran isn't the innocent party either. Iran is not a nice country. It's oppressing its people. A lot of the Iranians, especially the educated class, would like to have peace with the West, but the Ayatollahs and radical Muslim will not permit it. They're not involved in the same conspiratorial issues of the big three, Russia, China, and the Western globalists, who want to take over the world to create their own version of the New World Order. The Muslims have this dominance in their religious doctrine, that they want to dominate the world with Islam. And that's not a particularly viable or threatening issue for the West as the communists. And I mean the communists, including Russia, because as I've explained in my website, worldaffairsbrief.com, Russia faked its own demise in 1989 to 91. They took the Communist Party underground and they faked their own demise. So they're still communists. And they're faking a lot of things. They're faking being Christian and anti-woke, that is, Putin is. And unfortunately, conservatives in the United States and Canada are buying that up like warm milk. It's just really sad that they can't see, because they haven't studied their conspiratorial history of the phony fall and the many deceptions that they've pulled over the years. But going back to Iran, Russia, once again, is going to back Iran to a certain extent by putting in more S-400 anti-missile systems, which are going to make it difficult for Israeli aircraft to go in and take out. So what is surprising about this is that the Biden administration, by the way, Biden's not making any of these decisions. He's a pure puppet. His national security team is what's driving this, and they're all globalist deep state. Now, they have long intended to take down Iran. Why do they want to take down Iran? Because Iran is the only Muslim country that is self-sufficient in weaponry. In fact, they're providing weapons to Russia now in the war on Ukraine to a great extent, and have, especially in the matter of drones, Russia's building their Shihab drone under license from Iran. But Russia's not going to intervene in this war directly, but they are going to provide intelligence, satellite warning systems, and S-400 systems to help protect Iran. Now, what I think is going to happen, first of all, the Biden administration is telling Israel, don't react in a major way. They know that Israel is going to react in some way, probably a token way, or to hit certain strategic targets without killing anybody important, because their people expect them to respond to this. Because Israel has told their people this is unprovoked. It isn't unprovoked, but that's what the Israelis believe. But nevertheless, the Biden administration, I think, is running out of ammunition. It's running out of missiles. It's getting low in inventory because of Ukraine, because of the Republican reluctance to let the military-industrial complex gear up, and the fact that our missiles and our industrial complex is so much more expensive than any other country, including Iran and Russia, that we're just having real problems with supply now. And I think that's the main reason why the U.S. is putting the clamp on Israel. Don't start a big war, because we can't support you with enough anti-missile missiles. They've used up a lot in the Houthi thing, and part of this is Iran's desire to use up these missiles, and that's what the whole Gulf thing was about. It really, the excuse was to, support Hamas against Israel, but I think the long-term strategic goal of the Iranians is to weaken the supply chain in the West so that when big wars do come out, including the Third World War, they will be in trouble. Now, the globalists know that the Third World's coming. They want it. They know the Chinese want it. They know the Russians want it. They just have to wait until the proper moment and the proper trigger event. And so they've got to reserve a great portion of their anti-missile structure for that war. And that's what this Iranian-Israeli war threatens to do. So I think Israel is going to do a token. I mean, it will look big. It will be amplified by the press, but it's not going to be an all-out attack on Iran, because they don't want to precipitate. And Iran has said, we're going to give you a 10 times barrage of missiles if you counterattack in any significant way. And believe me, that can use up all of the Iron Dome systems if they come out there with 3,000 missiles instead of 300.
And so when you say that you think that Israel is trying to provoke Iran, right now they're in a position where they have this leverage where they could potentially do a retaliatory strike, which was not a token strike, and thereby bring the United States into the conflict. I've always thought that if the U.S. was serious about trying to rein in Israel, they would simply threaten to pull funding. Maybe they would remove some military assets from the region. But it seems like they're now putting the ball in Israel's court and saying, please don't escalate, but we're not really going to do anything that's actually going to hold you to account and force you not to escalate. So it seems like Israel may actually make a move if Netanyahu is concerned that he's going to potentially lose his grip on authority in the country. Is he not incentivized then to start this war with Iran?
Well, remember that the U.S. policy long has been for Israel, you start the war with Iran, you provoke it, you start it, they will bloody us by hitting American troops, and that's why we keep troops in Iraq and Syria. We keep them so they get bloodied, so that we have people killed, and that gives us an excuse to get into the war. And that's been their plan for years. Iran has not taken the bait. That's why this has not been implemented. But you see, Ukraine changed all that. Ukraine used up a great deal of our extra munitions, including artillery, including, rockets and especially anti-missile systems. I mean, you've got a lot of Patriot systems. They've used up a lot of Patriot missiles, which are, very expensive missiles to shoot at drones coming in. And that's what Ukraine's been doing. And so this changed the whole complexity. Netanyahu is a globalist. Remember, he's not working for Israel. He was a Kissinger protege. Kissinger paid for his education in the U.S. Kissinger set him up in Wall Street to become wealthy. Kissinger set him up in Israel to become a star politician by holding a major international conference, which he sponsored. So he's a pure puppet of the globalist. But he's between a rock and a hard spot. People expect him to defend themselves. Remember, Netanyahu is also very corrupt. He's been under corruption indictment for 12 years and has evaded that. And this is a major purpose of evading that, is to be engaged in war, because you never unseat a sitting president or prime minister during war. Now, that isn't going to change just because of this lull in response. You've got Iran's got a lot of things in their pocket. They haven't yet used that major barrage that could come from Hezbollah in Lebanon. And of course, they've got huge stockpiles themselves. Yemen still has stockpiles that they can contribute to the war. But I think the problem is not, let me just say this, Nate, it's politically impossible for any administration, Republican or Democrat, to cut off aid to Israel. The Israeli lobby is so powerful in the United States that every single politician of any note or power is beholden to the Israeli lobby. And they can get crucified in the press if they try to pull funding. So they can't use that as an option. They have to use under the table or secret talks and say, look, don't do this. And I think they've told Israel, don't do this because we don't have the weapons to back you, or you could use them up to such an extent because we would have to back you, especially if Iran retaliates against U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria. We'd have to use up so much of our stockpile, we'd be vulnerable for World War III. And China could then launch an attack on Taiwan, and we would be unprepared. This is the big problem that the globalists have never yet confronted ever before. They've always had enough weapons until now because of the Ukraine war.
One of my concerns is that in our depletion of our conventional weapons, we may start looking at the nuclear stockpiles, and particularly Israel. Could this be something they utilize in the case of a deterrent? We've seen the lengths they'll go to in the Gaza Strip. If we just increase that in order of magnitude, is it that out of the question to presume that they might resort to the Samson option if Iran retaliates in a major way like you're predicting?
Yes, but only if Iran retaliates in a way that really seriously damages the IDF. If you hit all of your major bases, in fact, you hit the Dimona reactor, so they can't make any more nuclear material. If you hit their nuclear stockpiles, there's a lot that Iran could do to put Israel in a position where Iran becomes an existential threat. Now, right now, Iran is not an existential threat because the U.S. is there to back up Israel. But remember, before Israel would go to the nuclear option, and it wouldn't be necessarily even lead to a nuclear war, because it would look like Israel's fully justified in lobbing one or two nukes to destroy their nuclear weapons stockpile, if Iran has it. And I still doubt that Iran has it, because they have been reluctant to start this war or respond to this war with Israel. But remember, before they use the nuclear option, they would have to exhaust all of the U.S. ability to come to their aid. That's the priority, and the U.S. knows it because they don't want to start a nuclear war early. Remember, the globalists want to make sure that Russia and China start this nuclear war. Now, they will provoke, but it's not because Russia and China are innocent parties. It's because they haven't been ready yet. Now, Russia's ready to strike militarily the West, has been for many years, has the largest nuclear stockpile by far in the world, despite these dumb disarmament treaties that the U.S. has signed, which the Soviets violated, and the Russians continue to violate. But they can't nuke the West because they can't occupy it. And if you can't occupy, the enemy that you've nuked just rebuilds over time and comes back to get you. They can hardly occupy Eastern Ukraine, let alone all of Ukraine, let alone Poland, let alone Eastern Europe. They just can't do it. They have to wait till China is ready to strike with them. And China isn't ready. China's not going to get provoked into a war until they are ready. And believe me, they're going to be ready within probably 3 or 4 years. 2027 is when Xi Jinping says we'll be a first-class military. And that matches my timeline of when I think, not that it necessarily may start that year, but that's when China will be ready. It could happen at any moment at that time. So I think the nuclear option is way down there on the list for even the globalists, because they don't want something to interfere with the big strike. They want, the U.S. military decapitated in a joint Chinese-Russian strike, because that's the only way you get Americans and Canadians and Britons back into a militarized global government. Everyone in the world depends on the U.S. military to save them, and if you allow that strike to fall on military targets, and I've long said in my World Affairs brief, the U.S. intelligence with their spies in China know that they don't intend to hit cities in the first strike, only military targets, because then they want to blackmail the West into submission. They don't want to destroy the country and the economies that they depend on, but they do want to control them in their own version of the New World Order, and that means a nuclear first strike. Now, I might say they have long been attempting to do race-based or race-targeted bioweapons. And Israel's tried to do race-targeted bioweapons against Arabs, not Jews. But no one's been successful at that sort. No one. And that means China and Russia will have to return and stay with the nuclear option as a way of blackmailing the West into submission. Now, as I say, they don't want to destroy the infrastructure. per se, but an EMP strike doesn't destroy the infrastructure. It does destroy populations because so many people starve. And that's the preferred solution. If you don't have bioweapons, you can starve to death by throwing an EMP strike. And really only Russia and China have the capacity to do that. China has orbiting satellites at the altitude that can, if they are nuclear, have a nuclear weapon in them, can do the nuclear strike from existing satellites. They don't even have to use missiles. So this is a very real threat, and people need to prepare for it. That's one of the problems with Donald Trump running for president. People think, well, if we get Donald Trump in there, we won't have to prepare. In other words, he'll save us, and that won't necessarily.
So we know that Iran recently, apparently, the IAEA inspectors have left the nuclear facilities there. We've seen House Resolution 559 pass, I believe, 6 months ago, and that is basically setting the precedent for the United States to get involved and come to the aid of Israel if they suspect that Iran has made progress on their nuclear program. So now you have a situation where, the casus belli is there. You have Iran removing this IAEA inspector. Where do you think these targets are going to be in Iran when Israel does strike? Because I mean, as much as we know that, according to the Iranians or the Ayatollah, he says that, well, we don't want nuclear weapons, we don't believe in nuclear weapons, but aren't the Iranians now going to accelerate that program, and isn't that going to beget a Israeli response, which is likely going to trigger a broader conflict?
Tough questions, Nate. Israel has the best spy network in the world. They've infiltrated every single Muslim country in the Middle East because they have Arabs that live among them that they've recruited as spies and trained as spies. And so it's not like a Jew going into Iran and trying to spy. They have Arabs that go in there that can and do look the part. So I think Israel knows that Iran has been working full steam ahead on their nuclear program. Now, it takes a lot of time to get your first nuclear weapon and to get a multitude of nuclear weapons because of the centrifuge process of enriching uranium. I think Israel will know when. Now, they have put out disinformation here and there about Israel and fed that to the U.S. But the key element is that if Iran really has nuclear weapons in their stockpile and is ready to use them, they will attack and start, or at least use Israeli provocation to do a major attack. The mere fact that even Iran now is saying, we don't want to respond, but if you respond in any major way, we're going to up the ante 10 times. So this seems to be a tit for tat thing. All of that hints that Iran isn't yet ready with their nuclear option. That's the major evidence, is that if they were ready, they would be much more confident, they would be much more arrogant, they would be much less restrained in terms of what they do with it. So I don't think they're ready yet. Now, as to what the targets are, I know that Israeli military, through my sources in Israel, they've got a whole list of about 10 options in terms of level of strength of what they want to hit in Iran. And they haven't got the go-ahead yet because the U.S. has really told them in no uncertain terms, we don't want anything big happening. So of the smaller options, first of all, there are intelligence centers, there are satellite reception centers, which they get their intelligence from Russian satellites. There are missile defense systems that they want to take down that don't require loss of life. They're not going to hit major cities. It's a real question whether or not they hit their underground nuclear facilities. Now, they can't get to those without a nuclear weapon because they are underneath the mountains. They can blow up the entrances, though, to make it so that Israel can't continue to work on it for a while until they clear those entrances. They may do something like that. But I think it's going to be, given what I know about the U.S. restraining Israel, it's going to be something that does not provoke Iran into really doing a massive missile strike.
So if the Iranians aren't ready yet, and we're hearing this language about pre-crime, like preemptive strikes to ensure that they don't get to that point where they are ready. Could you see this being the rationale that the Israelis use to try to loop the United States into a conflict? And if the Israelis do push those buttons, is the U.S. going to potentially just say, hey, you're on your own now? I mean, none of us can really see that happening. So it really seems like all the leverage right now is in the hands of the Israelis, and the fate of the American military is in their hands. Because what I'm concerned about is that if what you're saying is true and the Iranians aren't ready, then the Israelis might see this as an opportunity to interdict the progress on that program, thus setting it back maybe another 5-10 years.
Well, first of all, it wouldn't set it back that far. As I say, the only thing that they can do is hit their above ground facilities or entrances to these large tunnel operations where their centrifugal things are now. They're immune now from a Stuxnet type attack. They've got a lot of cybersecurity on their systems, so that's not going to work again either. So, if I were in the Israeli war room, I'll tell you, I would be I would be wringing my hands because of the restrictions that the U.S. is putting on this and trying to second guess what the Iranians are going to respond with. In other words, the U.S. has told us, speaking as an Israeli, the U.S. has told us, don't do anything that's going to provoke a full war with Iran because we don't want to expend the munitions to defend you. The U.S. would have to if it happens. So you see, it's a very tenuous decision. How much do we strike? And trying to know how the Ayatollahs are going to react is very, very difficult. Unless they have spies at higher levels than I think they do, then they might have a better idea of how the Ayatollahs are going to react. But it doesn't appear that they do at this time, because of what I'm getting from Israeli sources about how difficult this decision is. They must respond in some way, but how much to make sure that it doesn't turn into the full-blown war. Now, they want the war eventually. I mean, this is what's been planned for years with the globalists, but now the U.S. is in a tough spot because they've used up too much of our missiles and ammunition. So this is a very interesting situation. The globalists have never been in this position before, but it's going to restrain this thing going out of control, in my opinion.
Okay, well, that's good to hear. In terms of the Russian involvement in Iran, you're saying they're sending more S-400 systems there. Isn't Russia in a predicament as well, where they're a bit more, where they're limited in terms of what sort of assistance they can provide the Iranians? And do you think there is a possibility that the Iranians are in some way under the nuclear umbrella of either the Russians or the Chinese?
Well, yes, Russia does have limited abilities to stretch their S-400s any more than they are. They need a lot of them in Ukraine. In fact, they need them in Moscow and around that too, because of the long-range drones that the Ukrainians have gotten a hand on. Or they're using actually A-22 civilian aircraft, like a 172 high-wing aircraft, and just flying them low about 100 feet off the ground. They can't be picked up by radar, and they're doing a lot of damage with those airplanes, with the fuselage full of explosives. But I don't think there is an umbrella over Iran, a nuclear umbrella over Iran. I don't think Iran's going to be the trigger for World War III. And as I've long said in my World Affairs brief, I think the trigger is going to be Taiwan and North Korea. Because remember, if North Korea has vowed that if we try to intervene with the Chinese attack on Taiwan, that they will attack the U.S. and South Korea. And we got 26,000 troops in South Korea. We have to respond to that. And I think because of the overwhelming military power or balance from Kim Jong-un, North Korea versus South Korea, we'd have to use perhaps tactical nuclear weapons to stop those massive attacks and artillery attacks on Seoul, which is within artillery range of North Korea. And you see, because China has this immutable pact between North Korea and China to come to their aid, if we're in a full war with North Korea, that brings China in, and China would respond, I think, at that time with a preemptive nuclear strike on U.S. military targets, along with Russia. And that will start World War III. And you'll know that's going to start if you see this blow up in Korea and Taiwan and Korea. I say you got about 3 weeks before we're in an all-out nuclear war. So that's the warning sign. You got 3 weeks. Now that's not enough to prepare. That's enough to get out of the cities. If you're stuck in the cities and you're staying in the cities, which you've got to be careful of, because if you don't get out in it with advance notice, as I try to give my subscribers in the World Affairs Brief, you'll be stuck in there, and it's very difficult, even if you've made survival preparations to survive in an EMP strike, because everybody's going to be pillaging and going house to house hunting for food within 3 days after an EMP strike. And so it's impossible to grow a garden, for example, in a suburban area because of those refugee flows.
So in terms of the Middle East then, this you think is likely going to be isolated at worst to a regional conflict, even if the Samson option is used. I've heard some pundits on the Israeli side talk about it using an EMP on Iran. Do you think that that would be some potential in between, instead of going to the extent of actually dropping a nuke, but detonating one, over Iran or over Tehran or something like that, and blacking out the Iranian grid? And what affects
well,
it?
that's true. Now, let me just say, that's a very good tactic, except for one thing. Israel's in range of an EMP from Iran, and they have it too. And Israel would be very disturbed if they lost their grid as well.
You think that Iran has like a nuclear EMP?
Well, they certainly, if they've got a nuke, they're going to have an EMP because they know that that's a formidable weapon. I don't think they necessarily have it now because I'm not sure that they have a nuclear weapon. But, that's one of the first uses. If you get your first small nuclear device, is put it in a missile and use it as an EMP device rather than a one-time nuclear strike, which would create a hornet's nest, whereas an EMP strike just simply takes down the grid in Israel. So I'm suspicious that may be their first option if they get their first nuclear weapon.
Yeah, and using it over Israel would be more challenging because, of course, it is indiscriminate, and that would likely affect Lebanon,
Jordan.
Syria.
Yeah, Jordan. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. What do you think happens to oil prices? And I'm not sure if you can see, but on the screen here, gold is hovering around the $2,400 range. What do you make of the oil prices that don't really seem to be responding to what's going on in the Middle East in the way that people would have predicted? And then you also have, on the same token, you have gold going up. So it seems like both of those should be going up. But what is your forecast for, if we see this situation continue to get out of control in the Middle East, what do you think effect that's going to have on the global economy?
Well, it's certainly going to have an effect on oil. If you have a full-blown war with Iran, they'll close the Gulf. All right. So that really cuts down about, 40% of your oil supplies in the world. Going to be a big problem, and oil prices will spike. Now, what I want to say about gold is, remember, gold went up to almost 29 for a day and then right back down to 24. Gold should be $5,000 an ounce now. It is completely and totally manipulated. And it's only because of the strength of the global crisis that it's been allowed to eke up to 2,400. But this is a pittance compared to the inflation that we've experienced. And silver's still flat, below 30. And so it's very difficult when you have a heavy manipulation. Here's how I think they do it. I think the major central banks that have all of the gold and do the major trading, I think they sell on the open market and then they buy back in private that's not on the market. In other words, you buy back in private and you sell and then you keep it down as long as you want to do, because you're really not exchanging value. It's just trading gold with one side of the market, the downside of the market. And that's the only way I think that they can continue to depress gold and silver in such a high inflationary market. Your listeners should know the government is saying, inflation's rising above 3%. And no, it's always 3 times what the government says in the CPI. So real inflation's 9 to 10% right now, and it was 12 to 15% during the high point after you gave all that money, COVID money, to people. That always spikes inflation.
So I heard RFK today. He said that Israel, and the purpose of Israel is to be this watchdog over the Middle East, to manage the price of oil, to keep the price of oil in check. And that if we were to relent in our support for Israel, that Russia and China would essentially control the entire oil market. Do you think this is part of the motivation then for the United States to be involved? I mean, it's kind of a naive, stupid question for it probably sounds like it because we know the answer. But what role do you think Israel plays in this part of the economy in terms of modulating the oil price?
Well, JFK is just pandering to the Israeli lobby right now. This is ridiculous. Israel is the instigator of most of the violence. And in fact, all of the Arab nations that are banding together against Israel because they know that Israel is part of the combination to take down Iran, which is their main defender. Iran is the main defender. In fact, when I go back to General Soleimani, for example, U.S. intelligence told Trump he was the biggest sponsor of terror in the world. It was an absolute lie, 100%, 180 degrees out from the truth. Soleimani, in fact, was the armor and funder of the Iraqi militias that were taking down ISIS, which was created by the U.S. deep state. ISIS was 100% creation. They took about 50% of the jihadists that they took out of Egypt and Tunisia and put them into Syria to create a, quote, civil war. And it wasn't a civil war, it was an external attack. And took about half of those, gave them priority and funding, and sent them off on a rampage around the world. And Soleimani knew that, and they went after, he funded the Iraqi militia that went after it. And the U.S. was busy saving the ISIS leaders. They sent in helicopters in the Battle of Mosul and took ISIS leaders out. They saved ISIS in total in the last battle in Raqqa by sending in 50 semi-trucks that took out ISIS and their families and their heavy weapons and took them back to Syria where they belong. So, people really have to wake up to the fact that the deep state is really the problem, and and Israel is part of that. Now, the Israeli people, I differentiate that from the leadership, which is globalist. Because Netanyahu's a globalist. He believes in the conflict creation in order to get solutions which Israel or the West would not normally absorb. But Israel's not the person that keeps Israel together. It's the fomenter of most of the problems in there.
Interesting. Boris Johnson similarly said today that if Ukraine falls, it will be a catastrophe and it will be the end of Western hegemony. I actually couldn't believe he actually just outright said it, but he did. He said that if Ukraine falls, it will be a catastrophe and it will be the end of Western hegemony. Do you believe there's truth to that? And what is your take on what's going to happen with Ukraine?
Well, this is a very, very good question. I'm glad you asked it because the globalists right now, I know this galls us as anti-globalist conservatives. It galls us that the people that are pointing the finger at Russia as the bad guy are actually telling the truth now. Now, we're not used to hearing any of the mainstream media or any of the globalists tell the truth for decades, because they have been covering for both Russia and China for decades in creating the two new enemies, or the world enemies they need to bring us into World War III. That's why they've been doing that. But just like they backed Hitler and his chemical weapons and his armaments, they switched sides. They reversed course just before the war so that they were on the right side when the war came. They were anti-Hitler. They've done the same thing. Right up until, remember when Romney was running in 2012 and he made that statement about Russia being the biggest threat, and the media just crucified him over that. What do you mean Russia's a big threat? You see, they were still in the mode of covering for Russia in that time. And they covered, by the way, for the phony fall of the Soviet Union. I was one of the two journalists in the world that blew the whistle on the phony fall of the Soviet Union in 1989 through 91. And I documented it. Christopher Story in the UK, who's now dead, also documented that it was a fraud. And J.R. Nyquist in the United States also has picked up on that. But the evidence is very clear. And what's interesting is that Putin even admitted that to Tucker Carlson in his interview. And because Tucker Carlson has never studied conspiracy theory or fact, it went right over his head. He didn't see it. Putin said the Russian leadership effectively initiated the fall of the Soviet Union. Now that a lot of people say, well, the Soviet Union fell, so what's that? What's that? Well, remember the narrative, the official narrative is that it was a spontaneous revolution that the Soviets couldn't control, which everybody bought into. They told Reagan won the war, because he did tear down the wall. No, Reagan didn't the war. As Anatoly Golitsyn pointed out in his book, New Lies for Old and the Perestroika Deception, is that the Russians were planning, even before he defected, were planning on faking their own demise in order to get Western aid and trade because they were losing the arms race. And that's exactly what happened. Now, Putin lied again to Tucker Carlson when he said, we pulled down the Soviet Union so that we could get a peace and cooperation with them. Well, that's a lie, too. Because, and I documented in the World Affairs Brief, all the cheating they did even after the phony fall. They didn't, they let us disarm their old missiles, but they kept the nuclear warheads. The U.S. built a nuclear warhead factory to refurbish those warheads for them, and they locked us out of it as soon as that factory was done. We still found the SS-22 missiles that they claimed that they had disarmed during the INF Treaty. They were still in the caves in Romania and Czechoslovakia. That Václav Havel was a Soviet agent who pretended to be pro-Western in the phony fall, and so was Lech Walesa of Poland. The chief of the labor union Solidarity was a Soviet agent. You see, they faked this whole thing. Even Erich Honecker on his deathbed in Chile said, Moscow gave me orders to let the student riots or protests in Leipzig go forward. And the same thing with the Red Square protest in favor of Yeltsin standing on that tank. I watched a documentary where the Russians talked about, the only thing we couldn't figure out, they said, in the fall of the Soviet, where were the KGB when we were protesting? We didn't see anything. They would have arrested us instantly a year before, and suddenly where were the KGB? See, there was a stand down order. And then Putin told the next lie, which everyone in the conservative movement in the United States and Canada believes, and that there was a Western coup in Ukraine ousting a legitimately elected president, Viktor Yanukovych, who was a communist, by the way. It's true. He had won the election. In fact, all of the Ukrainian, because of the phony fall of the Soviet Union, communists never were purged out of Ukraine. And so that's why the Bidens were able to have so much corruption in Ukraine and get involved with Burisma. But all of the presidents were either fake Ukrainian nationalists, pockets in the pocket of Russia, and of course, Yanukovych was an open communist. But you see, even though Victoria Nuland and the globalists funded the revolution, it wasn't a Western coup, because the only way that it ever was won was because Yanukovych issued a stand-down order to the Berkut, the riot police that had the protesters surrounded in the Maidan Square. Let me repeat that. The president gave the order to the Berkut, the riot police, which was a vicious SWAT-type, organization, to stand down. And so the protesters were free to leave the square. They even were free to go through the presidential palace because there were no guards on the presidential palace. Now, could they have given the stand-down order? That's like the Trump protesters going to the Capitol and there's no police there. Who could have given the order? Only Nancy Pelosi. And then they go to the White House and there's no Marine guards. Who could have given that stand-down order? You see how you've got to know the facts in order to realize that that was a phony coup. And what was the purpose of that coup? Because you see, Putin wanted an excuse to invade Ukraine. He admitted in his interview with Tucker Carlson that Stalin and Lenin put Ukraine, the Donbass, into the borders of Ukraine, and Crimea, which are Russian-speaking here. They put them into the borders of Ukraine. And he said, I don't know why they did that. Of course he knew, because he knew that eventually when they faked their own demise, they had to have an excuse to come back and take back the Soviet satellite states like Ukraine. And the way to do that is to proclaim that the Russians are being persecuted. Now, could Viktor Yanukovych, a pro-Russian, pro-Putin president of Ukraine, could he persecute the Russians in Donbass? No, it wouldn't make any sense. And so he fakes the coup. He flees, claiming he was fleeing for his life. And who comes up after the interim president? Petro Poroshenko, whose best friends are oligarchs in Russia. He claims to be a Ukrainian nationalist. He campaigns on the fact that I'm going to let the Russians speak Russian in the Russian area. And as soon as he becomes president, he says, no, you got to speak Ukrainian. You can't be autonomous. And so they raised the cry, we're being persecuted. And sure enough, in that same year, Putin invades with his stealth troops. So you see, you have to understand your conspiracy facts and theories, and it's very complex. But I have the facts. And that's why I'm trying to get through to conservatives that Russia is not our friend. Putin is faking being a Christian. He's faking being anti-woke. The proof of that is the Communist Party has long followed the Gramsci, the Italian communist plan about corrupting American morals by infiltrating Hollywood, infiltrating music. So you say, yeah, he doesn't want woke policies in Russia. He doesn't want to weaken his army, but he does use it. And the communists, the continuing Soviets, use it in the U.S. to weaken us. And so you have to understand the complexities. These conservatives want to believe that everything's black and white, that it's either good or evil. And we know the globalists are evil. So Russia must be innocent because our globalists are against him in Ukraine. But in fact, the globalists know. And that's why when Putin talked to Carlson about his fake idea that I was trying to make peace with the West and I wanted to join NATO, and then Clinton's advisors told him no. Well, that's because, you see, if I could see that it was a phony fall of the Soviet Union, U.S. intelligence could certainly see it too. And that's why they didn't let Putin join NATO. But remember, Putin isn't afraid of NATO on his borders. This is a phony excuse as well. He already has the Baltic states on his border, which are part of NATO. So what's one more state? And it doesn't mean you have to put nuclear weapons near his border, because nuclear weapons can come from the U.S. You don't have to put nuclear weapons near somebody's border. But even more, and this is very important for your listeners, because in the phony fall of the Soviet Union, the West never required that communists be purged out of the governments of Poland, Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia. They're still there. And so when those countries joined NATO, so did their spies. Putin already has spies in NATO from all of these Eastern European countries that are part of NATO. Now, that doesn't mean that they're all bad in Poland. Really, they're not. There's a lot of good people there, but there are spies. And so Putin really isn't opposed to his nations joining NATO because it allows him to spy on them. So what I'm saying is this. Now, I don't agree that any money ought to be sent to Ukraine because it is still corrupt. But you can't let Putin get away with faking the demise of the Soviet Union and then taking back these countries. The people of Ukraine don't deserve to be under the continuing Soviets and being absorbed by that. And Russia is, I will repeat, is an existential enemy. They are going to strike the West someday. And so it is in our favor to weaken Russia's conventional military, which this war in Ukraine is. And so I do support military munitions to Ukraine to weaken Russia's conventional military, because what does it do? It means he has to wait, since he can't occupy because of weakened conventional, he has to wait for China. And this ensures that it will be a China-Russian joint strike, and it also ensures that when the U.S. goes to war, they will force Americans and British and French into a militarized global government, because the enemies are so large and so powerful against us. And what look at how they said yes to everything after 9/11. Well, after you absorb a nuclear first strike on military targets, Americans are just going to give up their hands and say, save us. Yeah, get us into the military, do whatever it takes, and wave the flag. And that's what I foresee as the future. I don't see this happening in the Middle East. I think it's going to be triggered by China attacking Taiwan and then a follow-on war with Korea.
Do you think these bills are going to get passed this week to provide more military aid to those three countries, Israel, Taiwan, and Ukraine?
Well, I hope they do, because as I say, now I don't support monetary aid to Ukraine because it all goes down the toilet of corruption. But I do support military armament because you can't let Putin get away with this. And so I do think that they're going to pass. I'll tell you, if the globalists know, and remember, they have reversed course. They're not protecting Russia anymore. And they started attacking Russia when Trump became president. They started earlier than what they intended to do because they used it to try to discredit Trump with this phony Russian collusion type of thing. But they have continued on. Now, they're not yet fully attacking China yet. They're still playing footsie with China. They still haven't sanctioned China. They still haven't cut off, technological aid to China and commerce. And one of the problems is that 80% of our consumer goods are produced in China now, and it's really going to hurt American consumers. But the globalists are doing the right thing, prosecuting Russia now. And I know it galls us as conservatives to see them saying the right thing. And I will be clear, they're doing it for ulterior motives, so they don't get blamed for this war. Remember, the globalists caused this war. They built Russia. They built China. The globalists even gave $20 million to the Bolsheviks for the revolution. Jacob Schiff of Wall Street and Lord Milner of the British gave $20 million to the Bolsheviks. We cut off military aid to the White Russians to let the Bolsheviks win. We cut off military aid to Chiang Kai-shek to let Mao Zedong win. We cut off military aid to Batista to let Castro win. We cut off military aid to Somoza to let the Sandinistas win. You see the pattern? The globalists are using communists to break down the social order, not because they are communists. They have a milder form of social. They still tell you in the West that you're free, that you have rights, but you really don't if you're a dissident, especially as the January 6th people knew. So conservatives have to understand and wake up to conspiratorial facts and history to understand why the globalists, right, because war is coming soon, they have to reverse course and start to attack Russia. Not because they're good people, not because they are the saviors. They aren't. They're as bad as Russia and China. There are 3 predator centers, not just one.
So my audience, I think, is a bit more politically diverse, probably. There's going to be some conservatives, there's going to be some moderates, there's going to be some what are conventionally termed liberals. But myself personally, I consider myself a bit of a political agnostic of sorts because, I personally view corruption as being somewhat independent of political ideology, and the rapaciousness of the oligarchs tends to know no bounds in terms of politics, possibly even religion. But getting back to the Ukrainian situation, because we're hearing a lot of talk now about NATO direct involvement in the conflict. What do you think the extent of that is going to entail? And what is your take on the introduction of F-16s into the conflict? It seems that would require a level of integration of and support from NATO infrastructure that would essentially bring them into the war directly with the Russians. And then what would the outcome, how do you see the situation evolving if we do provide Ukraine with more aid and they continue to strike deep inside Russia? I mean, I know you don't think that it's going to go nuclear in Ukraine, but it seems like that would be an escalation.
Well, let's be frank. There are civilian U.S. troops and there are special forces in Ukraine training and sometimes engaging in combat. There are intelligence officers in there helping and feeding satellite data to the Ukrainians to help them. There's a lot of technological flow to help Ukraine to be able to build their own drones and things, which they have done. And we're really trying to beef up the military aspect of Ukraine. But frankly, there's nothing Putin can do except rattle the saber about nuclear weapons if the U.S. gets more, if the NATO gets more involved. Now, one of the reasons that NATO is getting more involved now is because of the lack of munitions from the United States and from NATO countries. Now, NATO is a very, very confusing situation. One of the problems with the parliamentary system is, and when you have 25 members of NATO, you can't ever get agreement on it. You're paralyzed because of the veto power of people who don't want to help and don't want to pay for the war, et cetera. And so one of the things you've got to watch out for is NATO is provoking its own people by trying to get more involved in NATO, even secretly, and maybe even to get Russia to do a strike inside NATO, to be able to goad their own people into getting past this, I don't want to pay for the war in Ukraine. You see, the anti-Ukraine, anti-globalist fever is just as bad in Ukraine as it is in the United States. It's this mistake. The globalists are so bad, the Russians can't be bad, and so we really shouldn't be fighting. It's just a mistake.
I agree
So,
with that.
so watch out for the fact. Watch out for provocations of your own people or inducing uh, fear of a nuclear strike to gin up support for more military aid, because you really can't let Ukraine lose in Ukraine. Because if you do, the Baltics are next. And I put in last week's World Affairs Brief, and your listeners can get a free sample by going to World Affairs Brief and clicking on Request a Sample on the left. But I covered the fact that other analysts now are saying Baltics are next. And why are they? Because just like they put the Donbass and Crimea in Ukraine, they put hundreds of thousands of Russians into the Baltics, made them move over the border and live in the Baltic states, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. And they're being pushed to be called for persecution, et cetera. And that's the next step. Putin will be right there in a NATO country, and that would provoke a war because Baltics are part of NATO. But it would, as I say, be a nuclear war. You don't have to fear a nuclear war until China's ready, which they are not ready yet. So you may see conventional conflict. You may see conventional NATO starting to engage in conflict, but it will all be because the globalists know you've got to contain Russia in terms of conventional war so that it forces him and China to strike together when they do use nuclear weapons. And I can tell your audience, it's coming. So don't confuse, even those my subscribers to the world, don't confuse knowing what's going to happen with being prepared for what's going to happen. And you face the same thing with your subscribers. You have millions of onlookers, and they think, oh, I know what's going on because I listen to Nate. But that doesn't equate to being prepared for this war. And that's my problem with people who study too much about prophecy. It doesn't matter if you figured out the key to prophecy and you know when this is going to happen. You got to be prepared for it. I don't need to know the date that it's coming. I know it's coming because I see the signs of the times. I can see China preparing, and they are as evil as can be. You do not want to live under Chinese occupation, and they want Canada as much as they want the U.S. because they want the open spaces. They're out of agriculture. They can't feed their people. They want Lebensraum, living space. And General Hao Tian, in his 2015 speech, said as much. We want these wide open agricultural spaces because we need living space. And we're going to be ruthless. We're not going to be like the Nazis who were easy on the West. We're going to be ruthless. We better believe them, and we better be prepared to not let this happen.
So some people might say, though, that the sphere of influence of China is greatly diminished by the U.S. encroachment on their borders. With their putting military bases surrounding, putting nuclear submarines in South Korea. So as much as I agree with you that the Russians and the Chinese are not particularly good guys, I could see a pushback to that argument being. They haven't really partook in a lot of imperialistic pursuits in the past. The Chinese, I'm talking about, of course, not the Soviets or the Russians. So how are we so sure that that is what their plan is in terms of global domination?
Absolutely. The speech of Hao Tian, which was leaked to the Epoch Times, which are an anti-communist Chinese group, runs a very good newspaper, by the way. It was leaked. He's very, very clear. We are going to take the West. We are going to dominate the world in our own new world order. Now, let me just say, anybody who studies world affairs like myself know the Chinese are doing just what the West, in fact, even more. They have military bases all through Micronesia. They have bought up all the mineral rights in Australia. They have military people in Australia, and they're going to occupy that country. They are all over Latin America, including Panama and the Panama Canal. You talk about imperialism. This Belt and Road Initiative is their version of imperialism. And they are everywhere. And that's why Latin America is no longer a good retreat space, because it's going to be occupied by China anymore. Now, I don't think they're going to occupy the U.S. because we have 1 billion arms in private hands, and that's a recipe for guerrilla war. But still, they may get to the West Coast. And remember, they have they have submarines off our waters, too. So this is just, so do the Russians. So let's be honest about this thing. They're all working towards war. And because they want this war. They all want to control their own version of the New World Order. Don't think that you can pick sides and say, well, the globalists, the Russians are going to save us from our own globalism. Not so. That's a very naive thing.
I agree with that. I agree that there's almost people who are fed up with our own government and media corruption. They tend to go too far in the other direction. But how do you think this rearmament, this reindustrialization of the West happens? Because right now, as it stands, I mean, the industrial base that is building out our weapon systems is pretty pathetic in terms of our ability to compete with like the Chinese or even the Russians. So what do you think is going to be the impetus to trigger a resurgence in weapons production? And this is not something I want. I'm not an advocate of the military industrial complex. I don't like the neoconservative agenda. But, and I know that's not what you're saying here as well. I get your point of view is far more nuanced. But how does this get triggered? How does the rearmament of the West get triggered?
Well, it's like in every single war, the West has always been caught with their pants down in terms of armaments. And because there is no incentive to spend the billions. And that's one of the problems. We got so much money flowing to the military industrial complex that is way overpaid. And a lot of that is secret budget money. You see, you're overpaying for these submarines, you're overpaying for these naval shipyards and things because a lot of that money is going into space. Like General Mattis told a Booz Allen Hamilton conference after he got out as defense secretary, he said, you would be surprised how many billions that are going into space that aren't on the budget. Now, all the spy satellites on the budget, all the reconnaissance satellites, all the GPS satellites, all the communicate, all that's on the budget. So that can only mean, in my estimation, that they're putting space-based interceptors into space that were developed theoretically during the Reagan administration, the Brilliant Pebbles type of system. And that makes sense because, you see, PDD-60, that secret presidential decision signed in 1997 that instructs our missile forces to absorb a nuclear first strike and not retaliate until after you've been hit, to me is the indication that we're going to absorb a nuclear first strike, knowing that the Russians and Chinese aren't going to hit cities, they're going to hit military bases, and then want to blackmail the West into submission. So how do you stop the blackmail? You say, we're not going to abide. And when they threaten to nuke the cities, they say, go ahead and try. And when they try the second strike, our space-based interceptors hit their missiles in the boost phase, and those missiles, those warheads never get released or they get destroyed in space. Now, that gives the U.S. military time. You see, we had time after World War II in Pearl Harbor to beef up the military because they couldn't attack us. We were isolated from the war in Europe. But that's not true with nuclear weapons. So if you've got space-based interceptors, and believe me, I don't think the globalists would pull a PDD-60, absorb a nuclear first strike tactic unless they had a plan to win the war after you've decapitated the military. Decapitating the military is absolutely necessary to drive Americans in panic into a global militarized government, but you've got to have a space to keep yourself from being attacked while you rebuild. And I think space-based interceptors is that answer. So that's how I think the U.S. will be unprepared. They'll be beefing and going to massive production. They'll print whatever money is necessary to do that, just like they did in World War II to prepare.
So you think, let me just get this straight. So you think that they're going to do a nuclear strike on the U.S. and then we're going to
China.
Right, they're going to do on military targets. We are going to absorb it and not respond, and then rearm for several years.
Well, I would say they will respond with the few submarines that are out there that we have. But remember, the submarine warheads are not big enough to hit underground Chinese targets and underground Russian targets. So we can't stop their military. That's why you have to have some way to stop missiles. And our current anti-missile defense system has no warhead on it. It's incapable of stopping most attacks. So I really suspect that what Mattis was not saying, the billions going to space, has to be towards some type of missile interceptor system that's space-based. And that allows you to rebuild in peace, or relative peace.
So how does this factor in then to Russia's current aspirations to put fissionable materials in space? They're saying it's going to be a nuclear space station or nuclear power station on the moon. But are they, and of course, some people suspect that they already have nuclear weapons in space. They already had that program, that it was never scrapped, that it actually was always still in operation. But what are your thoughts on nuclear weapons in space?
Well, I think they're probably already there. I think EMP weapons are already in space. That's the easiest way to have orbits at 250 miles up, which is the ideal EMP altitude. You have orbiting satellites that can be triggered to give you an EMP without shooting a missile up there. So only Russia and China have the small nuclear technology to do that. That's very possible. Now, the U.S. has probably got to know that too. And the U.S. does have anti-satellite weapons. Russia and China are developing anti-satellite weapons. There's going to be an anti-satellite war at I think after this nuclear first strike, which is going to try to blind the military. Some of that may occur just prior to it, but I doubt it. I think they want it to be a surprise attack. And that's why you see the government is building these huge underground bunkers for their own continuity of government, but they're not warning any people to prepare for nuclear war. And hardly anyone's doing it except those that watch your party and that read my books and which help people prepare. And especially if you have a basement, that's the cheapest way to get a fallout shelter is to build it without a building permit inside your existing basement and conceal it. Having a concealed underground space to hide is the only way you're going to survive an EMP strike of refugees coming down the street, pillaging house to house. You're not going to shoot people that are just starving. You just got to be able to get out of the way. And that's what you need a shelter for. And that's why you need to have basement space. In some places in the U.S., it's difficult to get basement space in parts of Texas and the East Coast, which has this underlying rock layer 3 feet under the ground. I don't know. I think in Canada, you have a lot more basement potential.
Yeah, we do. Yeah. Yeah.
And that's good. But that's one of the reasons why I have written these books. And I'm not in the World Affairs Brief alarmed, and I've been in this, since 1982. I've been writing the World Affairs Brief, and it's not because I'm selling books. I actually believe in what's happening, and the threats of war have for many years known that we'd eventually have a war with Russia and China. And so I've been preparing myself and wrote these books to help other people prepare. Strategic relocation, how to get out of the big cities and pick the safe places, the secure home, how to do a high security construction of existing or new homes, and then the shelter book, which is how to do that shelter in an existing basement, which for most people is the cheapest option. And all those are available at joelskousen.com.
And one of the things that really intrigued me about your message is that oftentimes people who make these prognostications, they tend to favor a near-term timeline for whatever sort of selfish motivations they might have. The timeline is always right around the corner. It's always, within the year or within the few months or within a few weeks. But the concerning thing with your predictions is that they've always typically tend to be more realistic in terms of when these things are going to unfold. I mean, you were talking about, I watched a video of yours in 2012 and you said, yeah, around, late or early 2020s, this is when things are going to pop off in Ukraine. And, there was a lot of people at that time who, of course, were making far more aggressive predictions that it's going to happen sooner. And so when you say that things are going to pop off in 2027, I mean, to me, that's reassuring on the one hand that we still have time to get these systems in place. But it's also quite concerning because I know that your predictions are based on real analysis and you clearly have a wealth of information. We don't agree on everything, of course. But so when do you think this whole confluence, like how much time do you really think we have to get all these systems in place?
Well, good question, Nate. The important thing to remember is that I'm not predicting that things will pop off in 2027, only that China will be ready in 2027. Now, whether or not they pick the time, that depends on the trigger event. It could come a little early and it could come a little bit later of that. But people need to be prepared before that time. You don't want to be prepared late, one day late. You got to be prepared before time. So I think we do have realistically 3 to 4 years to prepare. And it takes about that long. I'll tell you, we have a family farm with full preparedness aspects, and it's taken us 4 years to put all this together. And I'm an expert. This isn't my first rodeo. I've been done preparedness places before. But you see, the problem, and here's my take on what I call the hypesters. There's a lot of hype out there from Natural News, even Alex Jones and other people. And a lot of that hype comes because they depend on insider sources. I have an insider in the White House. I have an insider inside intelligence. Well, let me tell you, there are no insiders on our side. The NSA covers all electronic. You can't call Alex Jones and tell him an insight without getting shut down within a day. If they're allowed to keep talking to you, it means that they're feeding you disinformation. That was the whole QAnon thing. That was a deep state operation to feed bogus information about true threats, general threats that got people hooked in, but all the specifics and the time date material that QAnon said turned out to be bogus. And what does it do? It discourages people. Oh, these things aren't going to happen. You know, Mike Adams is hyping a Chinese invasion through container ships on the West Coast. My complaint is when it doesn't turn out correct, they never apologize. They never say, look, I was wrong about this. They just keep hyping a new future date, you see, and it eventually gets people worn out because you cry wolf too often. So I have tried to be very credible and to look at the timelines that I think with real analysis of what it's going to take for China to get ready, because they're not going to strike until they're ready. Because they know the West is a formidable military, even though it's pretty thin. We're high tech, but we don't have a lot of depth. That's what this Iran war is showing, is we don't have the depth to go to war to 3 theaters at the same time. So I appreciate your confidence in my analysis. I hope that people listen and prepare, because when these bombs fly, it's not the time to prepare. When the electricity goes out, it's over. Your time of preparation is done. All you can do is flee if you haven't been prepared. And I realize it's tough. It takes money. It takes time. It takes dedication. But, I just want to say, I had a good friend just die who was an enlisted man in the military when I was a Marine. He's the only person I ever found who was enlisted with a modest, very small, modest salary his whole life. He never had a mortgage. He saved up enough as a single Marine. In those days, houses were cheaper, but he bought his first house and then sold it and leveraged it another. I mean, here's a guy that didn't make ever any more than $30,000 a year and became debt-free. You can do it if you sacrifice, if you stop eating out, if you stop, spending money on Netflix and other type of things. You can do a lot more in preparedness than you think you can, but you have to sacrifice. And you have to be restrained about your spending.
I agree. And, I was having a conversation with a friend last night about this, in that a lot of the things that, preppers want, they're actually quite cheap right now. Like the land that a prepper would want is actually relatively cheap, because that's not typically what the normal people out there are looking for, right? But once a disaster happens and you get that overwhelming demand that just drives the price through the roof, and we know the supply chain doesn't have that flexibility and the adaptive capacity to meet the needs of everybody at once. But right now is the best time. And so if you were to advise somebody on, let's say we got till 2028, 2029, let's be very optimistic about things. Okay. Where would you advise a person to focus? And obviously I would encourage people to go and check out your books on practical preparedness. But, if you could give us the elevator pitch, what would if you were middle-aged person, young middle-aged person, where would you be putting your eggs at this point in time?
Well, probably 3 things. Number one, you got to have a place to put your eggs that are going to be safe. Okay. So strategic relocation is important. Now, for those of you who can't leave the cities because your job's in the city, remember when this EMP strike comes, you're leaving the cities and your job is never coming back. You're not going back for the job. So you might as well prepare for a permanent relocation, even if you can't do it now. If you can relocate, you ought to get to the periphery of the metro area, the edge of it, so that you're the first one out. You don't have to travel through all of it. But most of all, you want a piece of rural property that's not on a major paved road, hopefully a long drive. And even though I have recommended states that are rate higher than other, I can find places that you can survive in almost any state. It's just that in the East Coast, you're going to get overwhelmed with refugees because you got 1,000 people per square mile, whereas in the West, you've got 50 people per square mile. But you need to be rural, even if you can't live there, and you need to establish an underground chamber that is concealed and safe. And I'm not talking about one of these steel tube shelter bunker type things that you have a big crane in and you bury it in the ground. Because when you get there, everybody is going to see that crane truck coming in, et cetera. And when you want to open that hatch, it's going to be surrounded with people. There's just no way to conceal the vents. They can be sabotaged. You've got to have a structure under a building so that you can go into the building and conceal your entrance down to a shelter, even if it's a shed over the top of a chamber. And, there's even concrete boxes that are major cisterns of 8 by 16 you can buy and have shipped in that are much cheaper than these tank things. And you don't need blast valves, by the way, that all these tank shelters come in because you're not in a blast zone. If you are, move. So that's the number one thing. You've got to have a place to go. And if you can't afford it, you've got to do something with friends or family that are in rural areas. And that means even chipping in financially, encouraging them to do a shelter so that when you get there, your food is safe. Or your guns or ammunition or whatever you need, you see, is going to be safe. And so you also need to make sure that you establish a way. If you're going to be in the city, you've got to get a map of a way out, remembering that beltways are like a moat around a city. You can't get across that beltway except in most entrances and exits to the freeway, which will be clogged with people getting on and off the freeway. So there are in every beltway 2 or 3 underpasses or overpasses that don't correspond to an exit or entryway to the freeway that you can get past that thing and out of town. You've got to plan for that. You've got to have a car that's got the tools and the spare parts to make it. And you want to pack a small bicycle or something on the back of that so that if you have to abandon your car, you've still got a way to keep going before you have to walk. Those are very important strategies to do. The other thing that I would encourage people to do is remember these new solar generators are the best way to get portable power without fuel. And they're fairly economical now. You usually $6,000 what you'd pay for a generator, but you've got lithium ion battery packs that you can keep charged. For a shelter, for example, to be able to put one of these things down in a shelter, it's plug and play. You don't have to have an installation expert to tell you how to do it. You've got enough power in one of those battery packs to last you at least 2 to 3 weeks, which is enough for the fallout period, because you don't want to be in a dark cave, when a fallout comes. So having one of these new solar generators like the Titan or the Apollo 5000 are 2 of the very best. That's the cheapest way to get alternate power when the grid goes out. And of course, it's better if you have some solar panels that you can put up after a nuclear EMP so they don't get destroyed. I mean, there are EMP protection devices, but they're pretty costly and technical to install. I prefer to keep most of my solar panels unattached and uninstalled and then put them up when the EMP thing is over. But having relocation, an underground concealed safe room, and this portable solar generator electricity are the 3 of the most important things, other than your typical food and water that you've got to have in these things. But those are the 3 key pieces of location and equipment that you got to have to make everything else worthwhile.
Perfect. Well, I think we'll leave it there, Joel, and I would encourage people to go and check out your website if you want more information on your perspectives on these geopolitical matters, and if you want to get the books. I like the fact that you haven't put your books on Amazon. That's respectable. Maybe we can get them into CanadianPreparedness.com. But either way, go get those books at joelskousen.com, and he doesn't have to worry about a middleman that way.
Well, They are on Amazon because people
Oh,
demand it, but I recommend that people buy from joelskousen.com. Why give money to the beast of Jeff Bezos when you can buy and help me out in my mission?
I agree. Well, I'm not going to put any affiliate links in this video then.
Right.
All right, Joel. Thanks a lot for coming out, and we appreciate it, and we hope to have you back soon.
Thank you very much, Nate.
Take care.
The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com, where you'll find high-quality survival gear at the best prices, no junk, and no gimmicks. Use discount code PREPPINGGEAR for 10% off. Don't forget, the strong survive, but the prepared thrive. Stay safe.